One of my favourite TV writers of all time is British showrunner Armando Iannucci. He created some of my favourite comedy. He was the inventor of Alan Partridge, and I could watch The Thick of It and Veep on a loop endlessly. There's nobody better at the art of the well-lobbed insult, nobody with greater faculty for both savagery and bureaucratic ineptitude. He's a comedic genius. So it came as a bit of a surprise a few years ago when it was announced that he was making a film about the internal social and political power struggle among the members of the Soviet Politburo following the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953. Not obvious territory for comedy. Picturing something with dubious Russian accents and period-specific detail didn't seem like the neatest fit. I needn't have worried. Here's a brief taste of Nikita Khrushchev, played by Steve Buscemi of all people, scheming with Jason Isaacs' Field Marshal Zhukov about what they should do about Stalin's chief enforcer, Lavrenti Beria. Fans of Iannucci's work won't need me to say this before playing the clip, but it's a little bit sweary.
I really need your help.
To do what? The bodies fucking piling up in the streets. A bit late, isn't it?
What if we blame this on someone who's out of control?
Nicky, be very careful what you say next. Who?
Beria.
I'm going to have to report this conversation. Threatening to do harm or obstruct any member of the Presidium in the process of looking at your fucking face. Nikita Khrushchev, you balls like Kremlin domes, right?
Stop. Be serious. Are you in?
I'm in. That fucker thinks he can take on the Red Army. I fuck Germany. I think I can take a flesh lump in a fucking waistcoat.
The genius of what Iannucci did in The Death of Stalin was to tell the story straight, with the language and accents idiosyncratic and resolutely contemporary. Because it's a story about politics and power, about cowardice and brutality. Historically specific, but thematically timeless. And it's a movie I thought of as I began to read Malcolm Knox's latest novel, The First Friend. It too takes inspiration from the height of Soviet Russia. It too is liberated rather than constrained by taking a real historical episode as its inspiration. Fans of Knox's gentle, vernacular explorations of fragile men and the relationships that enable or sustain them will see this new book as a departure, but also one that's squarely in his wheelhouse. There was a review in The Guardian that suggested that it reads like an alternate take on Elena Ferrante's beloved Neapolitan quartet, but this time the two friends at its core aren't Lila and Lena, young women in Naples, but they are instead one of the 20th century's most brutal mass murderers and his driver. I'm Michael Williams, and this is Read This, a show about the books we love and the toxic friendships behind them. Malcolm Knox began his career as a journalist for the Sydney Morning Herald back in the 90s. For a while, he was the chief cricket correspondent there, but he really broke out in 2004 when, as literary editor, he broke the story of the fake Jordanian memoirist Norma Khouri. He won a Walkley Award for that effort. Since then, he's written more than a dozen books of nonfiction and been publishing novels since 2000. The First Friend is his 7th novel. Each of your novels is quite different to the ones that have come before in kind of fundamental ways, but at no point in your career as a novelist has it felt like such a seismic shift to the shift that brings you to The First Friend. And I'd love you to share with us whether that was a deliberate seismic shift or if it's something that crept up on you.
Yeah, I've always had friendship at the centre of the stories I tell. Often male friendship, not always. And that was at the centre of this book as well. I began writing this in 2021, and it was, in the second year of the pandemic. Everything in private life and in public life felt as if it was moving closer to the edge, and the stakes were rising. For example, in friendships, you needed to do much less for friendships to be broken. And in my kind of little area of public life, small indiscretions became, things that had major consequences. And then when I looked beyond that, our public life was dominated by Trump, Putin, Xi Jinping, Boris Johnson all the way down to your mini Trump in Scott Morrison. So these things converged to give me the feeling that my kind of stock in trade of these domestic relationships needed both a bigger canvas and something closer to a fantasy canvas, because reality was outstripping what a fiction writer could do. So I was still digging into the old material that I've always dug into, but everything around it needed to be enlarged.
I mean, the continuity is certainly there, and the themes that have so defined your work are there, but there's something about the historical lens when it comes to fiction. There's something about occupying that space that does present a completely different set of expectations, I think, for the reader, a different tenor. How fun was it to identify what people generally want from a historical novel and then decide to either deliver or withhold?
This book was probably the most fun that I've ever had writing anything, and I hope that's conveyed, because it is, on a surface level, potentially quite a grim place and time. In the Great Terror in the Soviet Union in 1938, fun is not what immediately springs to mind. But you change one thing when you're writing a novel, you change everything. And that seems to be what you're getting at with the differences between this and my previous work. So I'll give you an example. I'd been for a long time very keen to write about a person who had been in my life who I'd always thought, I'll never come across pure evil in ordinary life, but I did once. And this was a person who I really thought enjoyed, sadistic personality, was as close as you could come to evil. And if you just twisted the circumstances a little bit and you put yourself in a place that was a mobster state or a murderous state, that person would be right into the heart of it. And I actually began interviewing other people who had had deeper relationships with this person. And one of them said to me, look, you write about him, nobody will believe you. Nobody will believe that a person like that could exist and could do what he was doing in contemporary Australia. But if you place that person in a far away, almost imaginary place, all of a sudden they become believable.
I can see why that would be liberating on a level of fun. I do want to dig in for a second more, though, on that question of believability. One of your other characters, the protagonist of The Wonder Lover, for example, that's your book about a guy who is a bigamist, essentially. I mean, sorry to reduce it to a single logline, but there you go. And it's a kind of extraordinary story about multiple families and about this guy at the heart of it. It's a kind of outrageous story. It's a almost deliberately unbelievable story, but that centres around a character whose believability seems to me to be very important, that you can have wild things happen around them because he rings true.
Yeah, I suppose it had to be believable to me because the things happening around us were suddenly not very believable. I remember in the early stages of writing this book, I was in hotel quarantine, locked up on my own for 14 days. Is that believable? Well, no, it wouldn't have been 18 months earlier. Was Trump in any way believable? No. Even Morrison was not believable, but it was happening. And so we were all having to suddenly adjust our personal settings to cope with a world that had not been believable until then. So it didn't work for me to de-link this story into a completely made-up fantasy world. It didn't feel right because when I was describing it back to myself or even to someone who was asking me what I was writing, I was providing them with a legend the place I've created, which is called Blah, is actually based on the Soviet Union at that time. The gangland boss I've created is actually based on Beria. So what's the point in doing a fantasy if it's just a thinly cloaked version of reality?
Does that create a kind of tyranny of expectation, though? I mean, famously, when Kate Grenville wrote The Secret River, historians took issue with it because he was a novelist who was using the historical record and historical facts to underpin a fiction. And even though it's a very old practice, Shakespeare's historical plays spring to mind. Despite it being a very old practice, there is an anxiety about the novelist or the fabulist turning their hand to fiction. Are you scared of Russian scholars?
Very much yes and no, because I have fooled around with the historical record and, I haven't used pure fantastical names for settings and people. But at the same time, as any Russian scholar will see, I've departed quite outrageously in some cases from the record and openly done so for the reason that when I was writing this, most of the world was living under leaders that were pretty shamelessly gaslighting their own populations. And I did think, well, where is the place in time where gaslighting the population was done to an extreme and done with complete impunity? And that was the Soviet Union, under Stalin in particular, where lying to the population was a kind of, it wasn't even a pretense. And I wanted to take that idea of a leader or a country that was openly giving away any claim to an historical record. And that was kind of what Stalin did. He was making an exchange. He was saying, every time I tell a lie and every time we cook up fake statistics, it's with the purpose of short-term gain. It's with the purpose of, the next step in the retention of power, the consolidation of power. And though, he was certainly motivated by his own paranoia. Over time, of course, it's a zero-sum game. Every lie he tells for short-term gain comes in exchange for long-term claim on any historical record. And you don't write with a thesis in mind, but if I did have an idea in mind, and this is motivated largely by my own anger at what was going on around me, it was that every little lie or big lie that Donald Trump tells or Scott Morrison tells is a direct exchange for how an historical record of their time will see them. So, Trump's kind of given everything away for short-term gain. Morrison gave, probably more than he realised away in striving for short-term gain. And so when Russian scholars, might question things that I've used in this book, my answer is, well, we all agree that that was a regime that lived upon and nurtured itself from lying. So it has surrendered any true historical record. And when you're talking about Beria himself or even Stalin, the rulers that I find them most comparable to are, the ancient rulers that somebody like Mary Beard writes about. And I heard Mary Beard speak quite recently, and she said, well, when you're writing about the rulers of ancient Rome, you're just piecing together a few clues, but even those clues may not be true. So every generation of historians that's written about the Roman rulers has been constructing a fiction that reflects the time that they live in and their own culture and their own motivations. So that's what I think I'm doing. I'm piecing together clues that some of them may be true, some of them may not be. Many of them have just been repeated so often that they seem true. But I think anybody who writes about the Soviet regime at that time is a fiction writer.
When we return, Malcolm reveals the major novelistic challenge of The First Friend. How do you balance out the blackness of this book with comedy? Where are the laughs in Beria? We'll be right back.
Everyone remembers the first step on the moon. What if it had been the last? This Kingdom of Dust by David Dyer reimagines the moon landing from the eyes of Buzz, stuck on the moon, his wife Joan, trapped on Earth by society's expectations of her, and Aquarius, a journalist compelled to craft a story he doesn't want to write. This Kingdom of Dust reframes what the moon landing meant for all humankind. This Kingdom of Dust is out now.
As America heads into its presidential election with ever-increasing mistrust and misinformation, the question on everyone's mind is, what went wrong? Journalist Nick Bryant's best-selling book, The Forever War, argues that the roots of the hate we see in America today can be found in its troubled past, and how the rise of Donald Trump has been 250 years in the making. The Forever War offers a perceptive look at America's unending conflict with itself. The Forever War by Nick Bryant is out now.
This is a question I kind of could have asked you after any one of your books was written and came out, but I'm going to ask it here because it still applies. Malcolm Knox, what's wrong with men of a certain age?
I've expended a lot of words on dramatising what's wrong because I don't know. If I knew what was wrong, I'd be in a slightly different job. I'd probably be a counsellor or a psychiatrist or, somebody out in the real world doing things rather than writing about them/us. In this case, at this time, it was that upwelling of anger. And in the real world, we've seen this ever since the pandemic, that feeling of greater and greater danger, physical danger. I know that doesn't really answer your question because it doesn't get back before, before the anger and before the outcome of the anger. But, it can feel so overwhelming that as a storyteller, the only place you can get to is the final stage. The explanatory stuff before it just feels so overwhelmingly complex and interlocked with so many social, economic, political factors that it's beyond me. And I would say it's beyond, if they're being honest, it's beyond anyone who's writing novels.
I'm glad it's beyond you because it means that that's the impetus to keep going back and writing it again and again and writing ways into it. At the heart of the book, as its title would suggest, is this friendship and this question of, for lack of a less resolutely 21st century therapy word, enablers and the ways in which love and friendship see us enabling other people. Was that the initial engine? Did you know that was the kind of dynamic that you wanted to explore?
Yeah, and that's always been my interest, going back to my first novel. I've always been really much more interested in the dog's body of the very active person, the enabler, as you put it, or the fixer, because very often it is the fixer who, while they seem a passive character, they're actually the one that does things. And within friendship, I guess one of my recurrent themes has been friendship before and after power flips. And this one is very kind of concretely that because Murtaugh was the rich boy whose family adopted this kind of smart little semi-orphan young barrier, and the relationship is one of a great power imbalance that gets very suddenly and overwhelmingly flipped by the Russian Revolution, where Beria becomes the boss and he keeps Murtaugh alive as his driver, as his enabler, as his fixer, and also as his witness. Beria needs that witness, but at the same time, due to the circumstances, the stakes have been increased to the extent where ordinary missteps in a friendship that I've written a lot about before, the stakes in this book are life and death.
Yeah. Yeah, no, the flawed friendship being shifted into this kind of setting is fabulous. As you say, the effect it has on the kind of sense of stakes. Were there times in writing it that you worried that you'd made the stakes too high, that the kind of atrocities, that the monstrosity is so stark, such an extreme example of monstrousness and its consequences. Was that hard to write, or did that have a kind of joyous weight of inevitability to it?
Yeah, I think it's hard to keep a sense of proportion and that balance between, upping the suspense for fictional purposes and also making it palatable to the reader, where, the fun quotient, it's black comedy, but it's very, very black. So how do you balance out the blackness with the comedy? And at the same time, if you overbalance on the comedy, you're letting them off the hook. So you are dealing with life and death, and you can't forget that. So I would say what you're pointing to is the major novelistic challenge in a book like this.
Returning to the kind of allegorical reading of this book and the ways in which, wherever you are in history or in fiction, fetishizing a particular kind of strongman leader has some kind of inevitable and terrible outcomes. What was the temptation to try and find something redemptive in this story, something redemptive for Murtov, whether it's with his family, whether it's with the fact that he's motivated at a personal level, not at a political level or at a wider level? Does that redeem him to you, and is that important that it does?
Yeah, definitely that he has individual, agency, if you like. But, he's redeemed by his love for his wife and his children, but that love must remain encoded and secret all through the book, and secret to a point where Babylina, his wife, can't even be sure if he knows what he's doing. So she will have to ask herself the question of how much she trusts him, and ask herself whether she has to take matters within her own hands. Redemption's a funny word, because it can seem like such a formulaic out for a novelist, and probably even more so where you've got pretty black surrounds, as this book does. We'll suddenly make him do something good, and the reader will be happy in the end that we've kind of pulled him out of the fire. But I think as you get to know this character, he's an everyman because he's passive, and I feel that in our day that we live in, that's how a lot of us try to redeem ourselves.
Not writers, though, or artists. If you're creating art, you're not guilty of being passive. No. Isn't that weird? That I kind of regard myself as a pretty passive person and a pretty scared person. I don't see myself as courageous or active until I sit at the keyboard where a fantasy of my own self takes over. Well, I'm glad it does, and very grateful to read the product of it yet again. It's been a treat to chat to you today. Thank you so much, Malcolm Knox.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks.
Malcolm Knox's new novel, The First Friend, is available at all good bookstores now. Before we go, I wanted to let you know what I've been reading this week. A few years ago, a debut book of short stories came out locally by an author called Katerina Gibson. The book was called Women I Know, and it was seriously good. Is there anything more exciting than getting to read someone who's just starting out and loving their writing? Well, Gibson is back with her first novel. It's called The Temperature, and it's every bit as exhilarating as her debut. It follows 6 characters through secrets and disaster, threading their stories together with grace and style and impeccable storytelling instincts. I'm having an excellent time with it. You can find it and all the other books we've mentioned today at your favourite independent bookstore. And one more little Armando Iannucci shout-out. He did an adaptation a few years ago of Charles Dickens's David Copperfield, and it is one of my favourite films of recent years. Once again, he uses contemporary language and rhythms to tell Dickens's story like no other, and it's an absolute cracker. That's it for this week's show. If you enjoyed it, please tell your friends and rate and review us. It helps a lot. Next week on Read This, I am joined by rock star writer and comedian Richard Osman to discuss his new thriller series, We Solve Murders.
Weirdly, every time I do start a new book or a new something, I think, I wonder if this is the one where actually I find that I'm going to be very, very serious this time, and I'm going to write a proper kind of, Booker Prize-winning 600-page novel. And as you say, within 3 pages, I'm writing about Twixes and, sausage rolls. And I think, oh, no, it's going to be more of the same. But my note to myself is always make it brilliant. Make it as great as you can do. Make it something you're proud of.
Read This is produced and edited by Clara Ames. The show is mixed by Travis Evans with original compositions by Zoltan Fetcher. Thanks for listening. See you next week.